Isolated deep in the forest, two boys are forced to survive alone in a world conquered by the undead, finding themselves forced to deal with monsters, wild survivors, and the harsh reality that two children like them can't understand. This fascinating story begins with Marco, a boy who lives with his father deep in the forest, hiding from a world that completely ignores his childish mind. He prefers to believe he lives in an enchanted forest full of mystery and magic. However, the reality is very different. One day, his father gives him a gun before going out hunting and entering the vastness of nature. During his absence, Marco has a strange nightmare in which he tries to wake his father from a disturbing trance. But before he can understand what is happening, the man returns home, announcing that he has seen a deer in the forest, one he will try to hunt at the next opportunity. At that very moment, his father asks him to prove that he can handle the gun. But Marco is still too young to control it with skill. Realizing this, the man gives up and, as a precaution before sleeping, takes the weapon away. The days go by, and we see how Marco's father prepares the area around the house, ensuring his survival and that of the child. Meanwhile, Marco spends hours sitting on the riverbank, listening to music and looking at the scar on his wrist, where the initial of his name can be distinguished. He finally turns off the player and entertains himself by drawing on the bark of a tree, until his father suddenly appears and orders him to remain absolutely silent. They must avoid making any noise at all, because only in this way can they merge with the forest and stay away from the evil that lurks outside. As night falls, father and son repeat the same words over and over again, as if it were a prayer. At the end, the man reminds Marco that he is still a child, and that if he is not careful, going outside could cost him his life. However, our protagonist still doesn't understand the pain of the loss that consumes his father, nor the frustration of living in that situation. Despite everything, he is still a child, and his restless spirit leads him to explore one day. As he walks to the river in search of water, he adventures beyond the established limits. Suddenly, he hears a voice that belongs neither to him nor to his father. Intrigued, he follows the sound and crosses the dense undergrowth until he reaches a house trailer where the noises are coming from. Curiosity overwhelms him, but he finally decides to go back home. He plays with the vegetables he has drawn faces on until his father takes them to cut them and prepare dinner. That night, Marco adds the trailer to his map, and the next day he decides to secretly return to explore further. He sneaks into the trailer through a window and finds toys that fill him with excitement. However, his joy is interrupted when he notices a slight movement among the shadows. Startled, he backs up as far as he can until a small toy car rolls toward him. He takes the car with shaking hands and returns it with caution. That's when he meets Miko, a boy his own age whose kindness inspires enough confidence in him to take off his headphones and share his music with him. At first, the noise and Miko's spontaneous reactions take him by surprise, but soon both children feel comfortable and begin to play. When their new friend introduces himself as Miko, Marco excitedly discovers that his name also begins with the same initial that he has marked on his wrist. He excitedly shows it to him and tells him his name. Then he takes a rock and draws the same letter on Miko's wrist as a symbol of their budding friendship. Intrigued, our protagonist asks him if he's seen the monsters. Well, he never has. His father has always assured him that the forest is a protected place where evil can't enter. Like that, he concludes that Miko must be a good person. Meanwhile, in the cabin, his father is trying to repair an old artifact when he suddenly notices his son's absence. And without wasting time, he takes his weapon and goes out to look for him immediately. However, Marco has already said goodbye to Miko and returns home with a toy in his hand. As he advances through the forest, a strange feeling unsettles him. Suddenly, an armed figure emerges from the trees. Marco instinctively tries to hide, but his efforts are in vain. The woman lowers her weapon when she realizes it's a child. With a firm but kind voice, she asks if Miko gave him the toy. Marco's reaction betrays her answer before he can utter a word, and the woman realizes something else. He's not deaf. Sensing that the man in the cabin is his father, the stranger asks him if he has a mother, but Marco remains silent and tries to get away. Before he can leave, she gently stops him and gives him a gift before letting him go. Then, he realizes the woman is his Miko's mother. When he finally returns to the cabin, he carries the bottles full of water and hides his new toy. To avoid suspicion, he pretends to have collected the acorns the woman gave him on his own. However, his father immediately confronts him with his usual coldness and harshness. He demands to know where he's been because he didn't see him in the river. His son, without saying a word, drops the acorns from his shirt in response. Later, in a tense silence, they both chop wood. On impulse, the boy approaches his father and tries to hug him, imitating the gesture he saw between Miko and his mother. But instead of an affectionate response, he is rejected with indifference. From that moment, our protagonist feels that his world has expanded. He takes advantage of every opportunity to sneak away and play with Miko. Over time, he begins to wonder if the M on his wrist could mean something else, perhaps the initial of the word mother. The warmth with which Miko's mother treats him awakens in him a strange and new sensation. During dinner, Marco isn't hungry, and his father notices his discouragement. Worried, he asks, "What's wrong?" Then the boy looks at him and, with a shaking voice, tells him he has a mother. The words leave him stunned. A long silence stretches between them before his father reacts without explanations and sends him to sleep. Immediately afterward, the man opens a locker in the cabin and takes a device before leaving the house for the forest. Marco watches him in silence, feeling deep within himself an overwhelming loneliness. The next morning, he and his father walk together through the forest, gathering supplies, until a dry gunshot breaks the stillness of the place. His father reacts immediately and orders him to return to the cabin while he investigates what happened. But barely seeing him walk away, Marco decides to follow him in silence. A second shot rings out in the distance. Marco rushes to find his friend, but upon arriving, he witnesses a heartbreaking scene. He sees his father appear in front of the woman, put an end to her suffering. She had been infested. Terrified, the boy flees from the scene and spends the rest of the day in confusion. As the hours pass, Marco notices how his father's sanity begins to break down as he realizes that the monsters they have fled from for so long are getting closer. The man takes refuge in a bottle, unable to hide his anguish. His pain turns to anger, and he begins unleashing it on everything around him. To escape, Marco puts on his headphones and tries to concentrate on something else, but his father's words, directed at his absent mother, continue filtering through the music. He reproaches her for abandoning them and assures her that they will never have their son. That night, our protagonist makes a decision. He stealthily extracts his father's strange artifact from the locker and steps out into the darkness. Pressing the object's surface, the tablet's broken screen lights up, playing a video. His mother appears, pregnant, happily sharing a moment with his father and sister. But the image distorts. Suddenly, the scene transforms. Now, his mother desperately begs her son to survive, assuring him with tears in her eyes that she never wanted to abandon him. The recording abruptly interrupts due to a glitch in the image, putting an end to the message. Marco freezes. Now he recognizes the woman's voice in the photograph. Without hesitation, he returns to the cabin and handcuffs his father to prevent him from following. He then gathers ammunition, weapons, and supplies. At dawn, he sets off to meet up with Miko. Upon his friend's arrival, he greets him with a huge smile. Meanwhile, in the cabin, his father wakes up and discovers with growing despair that the keys are out of reach. Marco takes charge of dressing the Miko feeding him. Noticing Miko's insistence on knowing about his mother, Marco decides to lie, telling him that she's gone hunting. Meanwhile, his father manages to break the tube he was handcuffed to and, noticing his son's absence, immediately goes out to look for him. The man scans the surroundings for traces, until finally, he arrives at Miko's RV. However, he finds it empty. The children have already gone deeper into the forest, getting further and further away on their path. Miko stops abruptly, insisting on seeing his mother. Marco regretfully confesses that his father has ended her life. He expects a horrified reaction from his friend, but Miko remains unfazed. His only wish remains to be reunited with her. Meanwhile, his father continues wandering through the forest, desperately searching for him. The children keep moving, listening for any suspicious noise, until suddenly, a first monster emerges from the trees. Frightened, they hide, but their shelter is not enough. Soon, dozens of those horrible creatures begin appearing. With no alternative, they lock themselves in an abandoned van, trembling with fear as the monsters surround them. Just as they seem cornered with no escape, Marco's father appears, and with lethal precision, annihilates each of the creatures. Upon reuniting with his son, he quickly checks that he hasn't been bitten. Then, noticing Miko's presence but without showing pity, he leaves him locked in the van and drives away with Marco, ignoring the boys' pleas to return for his friend. Halfway along the road, the man stops and in a deep voice warns his son about the brutality of the ruthless monsters that have invaded the world. However, Marco looks at him with contempt and responds with even harsher words. "You're worse than any of those creatures, because you ended the life of Miko's mother." The shocked man flatly denies the accusation. But Marco insists he saw it with his own eyes, then with a broken voice asks him if he also murdered his mother because he thinks he saw her in the video, hiding from him for a moment. His father tries to calm him down with a loving gesture, but, aware of the gravity of the situation, forces him to return with Marco. So the man is forced to drag him and hide him among the trees before heading back toward the truck. Meanwhile, the infected have begun to surround the vehicle where he left Miko. Without wasting time, the man opens fire on the creatures. Hearing the shots, Marco instinctively hides, but soon realizes that a zombie is approaching his position. He listens with his heart and grabs his gun. He repeats to himself that he is not afraid. He prepares to shoot. However, while the boy manages to shoot the monster that was approaching him and ends the threat before it reaches him, the sound of the shot alerts his father. After reaching Miko and verifying that he is still alive, immediately goes out to look for his son. He makes sure his son is okay and informs him that his friend is still alive and is looking for him. However, he soon realizes that he has been bitten by the zombie that attacked him by surprise. The impact of the revelation disorients him for a moment, but upon regaining his composure, he moves away and takes advantage of the cuff on his wrist to chain himself to a log in the middle of the forest, avoiding thus becoming a danger to his son. When the little protagonist approaches his father, he confesses the truth. He didn't kill his mother, his wife, but it was the zombies who caught her, and now she is transformed into one of them. With a gaze fixed on a photo of her mother, she asks if she has also become a monster. Her father, with tears in his eyes, tenderly replies that she hasn't. She's a fairy dressed in white, and fairies never change or become evil. On the verge of tears, Marco hugs him and begs him to return home. This time, his father doesn't reject the gesture, but soon firmly pushes him away to protect him from himself. With a calm but determined voice, he remembers the teachings he has always instilled in him and urges him to become strong enough to find his own path. Suddenly, the man begins to writhe in pain. His veins stand out intensely on his skin, and when Marco tries to get closer, his father yells at him to stay away. Devastated, Marco retreats and walks away with Miko as they advance through the forest. A shot rings out in the distance. His father has put an end to his own existence. Later, both children continue on their way through the night, their spirits down. Marco reads a story aloud until his friend falls asleep silently. He promises himself that he will find his own fairy, like his father would have wanted. The next morning, the children start again, stopping by the river. Miko plays with him to try to cheer him up. Meanwhile, Marco repeats to himself that he never backed down or stopped, for in his mind echoes a voice that urges him to keep going until he reaches the Valley of Stone, the place where, according to his story, he will find his fairy. He knows that he must be cautious with those he finds along the way. He must be brave no matter what adversities he faces, and above all, he must have faith because one day he will find what he is looking for. One day, in the middle of their journey, they spot a man listening to the radio, attentive to the news about the imminent collapse of the world. When this stranger notices their presence, he is perplexed to see, perhaps for the first time in a long time, two children. Marco, in a firm voice, tells him that they are hungry and heading to the Stone Valley in search of their mother. However, the man doesn't recognize the place and tells them he could help them if he didn't have to stay with his children. When calling them, the children discover with horror that their family has been bitten and turned into horrible zombies. Now confined in a cage despite the tragedy surrounding them, the stranger offers them some food and, with latent curiosity, asks them if they are normal, if they could be the key to a possible cure. But there is no answer that dispels their doubts. The hours pass. The young protagonists continue on their way, following the train tracks. They play carelessly until, by accident, they press the thunderous horn of the train. However, apparently, nothing happens. Soon, they seek shelter to spend the night in an abandoned car, but they notice dozens of infected emerging from the darkness. The creatures begin hitting the windows with fury, trying to reach them. But with Miko's help, he frees himself. They're spotted by a couple of armed men. The children are transported in a van to a survivor base, where, upon seeing them, the adults are incredulous. They cannot understand how two children have managed to survive in a world where supposedly all minors carry the virus. But as soon as Marco says his name, he is separated from Miko and locked in an isolated section of the shelter. The adults consider him more difficult to control than his friend. Meanwhile, Miko is watched with great attention by John, who looks at him with a mixture of amazement and shock. For him, Miko is an angel. Unlike Marco, he can't be infected. However, the conversation between the men takes a disturbing turn. Some wonder if the existence of a child as healthy as Marco could hold the key to a cure. Later, they ask him if Miko is his brother. He shakes his head and explains that they're simply keeping each other company because they're alone in the world. In another corner of the shelter, John sits in front of the radio and, in a slow voice, begins to tell his own heartbreaking stories about the pandemic. He comments that at the beginning of the pandemic, when his children were infected, they were executed for no apparent reason. It was at that precise moment that doubts settled in his mind, and he understood the truth. The virus was not the enemy, but the awakening of a new consciousness. He tells us that all newborns are carriers of the virus, an unequivocal sign that man's time has come to an end and that humanity must resign itself to a world without children. In other words, they're on the brink of extinction. Shortly after, we're shown a memory of Marco in the past, when his father arrived at the cabin in the middle of the forest. He assured him that the others carried evil within them, but that he didn't, because he was special. Suddenly, a man asks him to remain silent and takes him out of the place through a secret access. Before letting him go, he gives him a backpack and orders him to flee because he doesn't have the courage to annihilate him, as they demanded. Thus, our protagonist flees. But instead of escaping, he hides in the darkness, waiting for the opportune moment to return to the camp. With stealth, he manages to infiltrate again and wakes up his friend. Together, they set out at PM, fleeing along the desolate roads with the arrival of dawn. The man who helped Marco is executed for the suspicious disappearance of the children. Elsewhere, our protagonists have traveled a long distance on foot. Exhausted and thirsty, Miko complains incessantly until Marco, exasperated, decides to leave him hiding to go in search of water. He enters an abandoned building in the hope of finding something they can drink or eat. He soon finds clean clothes and a bottle of water. Upon exiting the balcony, he glimpses a family of zombies wandering around. However, before he can react, he hears Miko's voice calling him desperately. He has been discovered by the men from the camp, who are now after them. John manages to immobilize Miko and, not seeing Marco anywhere, assumes that his friend has abandoned him. Just as they are about to end the boy's life, a drone appears in the sky, catching their attention and forcing them to stand on guard. Suddenly, a hail of gunfire echoes through the air, hitting them in the face of the offensive. A group of survivors emerges from the bushes, noticing another presence inside the structure. The men go out in search of the source of the noise without noticing that they have left a weapon of one of the wounded on the ground. Meanwhile, Miko innocently takes the weapon as if it were a toy. In an impulsive gesture, he makes a sound with his mouth, causing one of the armed men to turn sharply and, without hesitation, charge at his alleged attacker, without realizing that he is a child. Devastated by guilt for his mistake, Marco feels completely devastated by the loss of his friend. Aware of what they have done, the men decide to leave, ignoring that they have just left a child alone, deprived of the only company that was left in his adventure. Now the boy tells himself that he must be careful with the people he crosses on his way. He thinks he hears his father's voice warning him that the evil wind only brings with it monsters, terrifying beings full of hate that despise children like him. According to his father, that is the reason why they try to destroy someone so special. However, as his journey progresses, he finally understands that the Valley of Stone doesn't exist. Now he is terrified and fears becoming one of those beings. Seeing dozens of the living dead trapped in the streets, he hides under a car to avoid detection. Holding the photograph of his mother in his hands, he realizes that he has arrived at the same place where she appeared in the image, hoping to find some answers. He decides to enter the abandoned hospital, but as he advances, he only comes across ruins until, in a darkly lit room, he sees the silhouette of a woman standing. For a moment, he feels in his heart that he is standing in front of his mother and, without hesitation, extends his hand before hugging her with strength. However, reality hits him in the cruelest way. Before he could react, the creature sinks its teeth in his hand, forcing him to step back. He realized that his mother was not there, that in her place he had only found a monster wrapped in evil. Once again, his father's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the strength he had forged along his path. But all seemed in vain. He leaves her photograph along with the page of his story on a wall covered with posters of people who had disappeared, like a silent farewell. Shortly after, a sound in the middle of the street catches his attention. Following the echo of that noise, he reaches an abandoned building where a holographic projection flickers in the darkness. However, the shrill sound only attracts the monsters. Our protagonist remains motionless, as if nothing happening around him. He closes his eyes and awaits his inevitable end. He doesn't notice the bullets that began to whistle behind him, nor how, one by one, the zombies fall, struck down. A woman approaches tenderly to greet him, but noticing the bite on his hand, without hesitating, she draws her weapon, determined to prevent the boy from suffering. However, Marco approaches her and, with the same innocence as always, embraces her. Then, her gaze falls on the boy's wrist, and she is paralyzed by a peculiar scar marking him as one of the newborn post-apocalyptic babies, those who were immune to the virus. The woman's something in her changes. Without hesitation, she takes him by the hand and takes him with her, making sure that he would never be alone again.